Start from the beginning. You've got your particle blaster from yesterday. It's a unit and timeline that has a particle emitter and a light in it, and it creates this blast. And we just connected our index trigger to emit that unit and timeline. What we're doing today is having this fire particle actually light something up. So we're on day 19 of 30 days of symmetry. Day 18, you'll have everything you know to make this particle blaster. And what we're going to do is kind of take an extension towards creating this system, where if I can get this particle to hit this box, I will get the box to light on fire. And I've made them moving, so they're kind of a challenge, which makes it an interesting kind of game. And then what you have here is basically under the emitter's particle emitter fire in the toolbox in Simmetri. That fire is connected to and emitting from the surface of this box. And you could tinker with that particle emitter and get a lot more effects. You could do a lot of the stuff we were doing yesterday to kind of get to really kind of dial in a look that you're looking for. You could actually add another particle emitter that's like smoke. You could do things that make the particle absorb the physics of the box itself or kind of inherit that physics. So we're not going to go too much into the exacts of the particles. We will learn a bit more about the emit from the parent surface today to sort of understand what that's like. But what we're going to do today is really focused on using the activating a spatial trigger so that it knows when my blast has encountered one of these boxes. And you can see here there's a green box with a trigger that's wrapping it not exactly at its edges, with like a little bit of play around the edges, and basically when the unit that I emit intersects with this trigger, it runs a little 2-line script which fires up the fire particle emitter on any of these boxes. So under here we've got all these like sliding units. This is the stuff creating that movement that makes it a challenge to hit. And then we've got ourselves the trigger, the green box, and then living under the green box, its child is the fire particle emitter, which is emitting from the parent surface. So we will be building this from scratch, and we won't actually, to make this easier, I'm going to do this in a very, very, I'm going to do this back out in the terrain space and make it very simplified, so that you can kind of then take that principle and add it back in no matter where you were in progress on day 18. So all we need to do is have the thing that we emit have a trigger activating node on it. And the thing that we're shooting out of our hand, if you recall from yesterday, is on this unit. And on this unit is a little node, just no volume, zero volume, simple point in space symmetry object, just called a node, which is kind of empty, and it has a position and a rotation. And then the one attribute that it has on it is this trigger activating attribute. And the point light doesn't have it, and the particle emitter doesn't have it, and the unit doesn't have it. Nothing in my in this unit with its timeline that I'm emitting many of these. Each time I press my trigger, I'm emitting one of these. Nothing is going to activate the trigger except this little node right here, because it's trigger activating. So when that node crosses through the trigger plane of any of these boxes, it then runs the script that's in these on the trigger of these boxes. So advance out of the unit, come back to the world space. If you look at one of these boxes, these triggers, basically this little section here, this trigger has a code in it. It's an on-enter code, and it really does one thing. It takes the fire, it takes its pulse's frequency, which is set by default to 0, and it instantly turns it to 70. This is all commented out. I experimented with animating that, going from 0 to 70, but actually getting from 0 to 7, just jumping from 0 to 70 immediately looked fine to me. And then it does one other line of code, which is to actually get rid of the thing which passed it. Anyway, the main thing that we're going to do is just this, which is this is the one line of code that we're going to be doing today, and it can create this whole overall effect. Let me show you one more time what we aimed to achieve here. And so it's actually difficult to, this one's very easy to hit. And once I pass through, it's lit on fire. And I got that one timed right. Gonna kind of lead it. Got it. So let's go set this up, and we're gonna set this up in an entirely new show. So what we're going to do is basically make a box unit that has a trigger that matches it, and when that trigger gets crossed, we're going to end up with a particle emission that is actually emitting. So let's set that up now. So what we need is a trigger, and oops, I clicked on the plain one. So what we need is a trigger, and we'll go to the box, trigger, and I'm just going to draw it with arbitrary length, dimensions, and then select it and come up to its shape property up in the property editor, and I'm going to change its dimensions to something like very obvious, like 1, 1, 1. Because I'm going to do the same for the box. And then I'm going to create a box under Entities, Box. And again, on this one, I'm going to come up to its box shape, which is under Mesh Model. I can also get there by double-clicking. Any of the entities you draw, if you double-click, it'll take you straight to the shape. But the longer way is go to Properties, expand Mesh Model, go to Box Shape. I'm going to set these dimensions to 1. The other thing is this box, I want things to be able to pass into this. Other things with rigid bodies and other things with, with physics on them and whatnot. So I don't want this thing to be, I want this thing to be kind of like just a colored kind of ghost space in physical space. I want this thing to not be really physical. I want things to be able to pass through it, traverse it. So I want it to kind of be ghost-like. So what I'm going to do is hit the rigid body, remove the rigid body so nothing can hit this thing. So I'll give you an example of what that now will look like. Right, so if I draw another box and I press play, things can just pass right through it. Yeah. Whereas if it did have a rigid body, it would look more like this, right? Little mass versus big mass. So I'm going to delete these, and this one, I removed the rigid body. So I clicked the little triangle next to rigid body, right, like this one, and removed it. So the other thing that I want, this thing is going to live inside the trigger, and so this thing itself should not activate the trigger. We don't want it, for some reason, kind of causing any issue with the trigger. So we want to get rid of trigger activating. This thing is just a physical visual representation of the trigger while in playtime. Because remember that when we go into present this, let me exit VR mode for a second. When we go into present mode, our triggers disappear. They're just force fields in space. They're just these spatial representations of a boundary across which, when you enter or exit, you're going to run a script. So this thing doesn't exist, and so when I go into play mode, I can still see it, but when I go into present mode, it disappears. So what I'm doing is kind of making this box be a representation of this, and this could be a box, or it could be something from Google Poly or some 3D model or whatever. And you could be using a trigger that was a sphere or a plane to kind of create your boundary. So anyway, I don't want this visual box to activate this trigger at all. So I'm going to remove this trigger. So I've selected the box. I come down to trigger activate. I'm going to remove that. I'm going to child the box to the trigger. So I want the box to go everywhere the trigger goes. So the box is going to be the box is a child of the trigger. Now I'm just going to center it on its parent, which is I'm just going to double click this roller or select and zero out the X, Y, and Z, which puts us at the center. And since we're the same shape, 1, 1, 1, and the trigger is also 1, 1, 1, we kind of match up really nicely. So I've got this nice, now kind of the setup of a trigger box. And when I go into present mode, anything that goes inside this now white box activates what's on the trigger. And the trigger can do something down its hierarchy really simply with code. It just finds a child node and does something to it. Like we could change the color of this box really quickly. So yeah, so let's put this trigger on the ground. It's 1 meter high. So let's make its Y dimension be 0.5. And so now it's set directly on the ground. So what we want to do is set the box on fire. And so what we need is the emitter. We're going to go with the pre-created one that's like kind of just a simple rudimentary approximation of fire. And we're going to place it. You'll see that when we place it in the space, it is it's just kind of a basic particle emitter. What are the properties here of fire? Well, it's a short lifetime. That's a little more, fluffed out. It's interesting. So the lifetime was kind of shorter. You can tinker with the lifetime. You might get more of like a licking flame if you increase the lifetime. I do happen to like that a little higher up. Right, like so yesterday we were working with this. We had wind. This one has some initial velocity. Does it have randomness? A little bit of randomness. This one seems to be biased towards the X direction. You could put a random, we did this yesterday with a little bit of random signal on this, so you get that kind of like licking flame, kind of wisping back and forth stuff. You could put those on here. Anyway, yeah, you could have all kinds of you could make all kinds of different things that that you can change all kinds of properties in here. Maybe you want to change the transparency and sort of make it a little bit lighter. There's all kinds of things, and then of course under the particle material there's a lot that you would potentially do. What you have here, I believe under I think it's the opacity map under translucency, is this you can see, it might be a little tough to see, but it's just this sort of like almost like spray painted, like blotched sense of what a fire particle might look like, and it's kind of grayed, feathered on its edges, fully transparent around it. But this is kind of one piece. This could actually be an animated texture. There's a variety of things you could do to really add oomph to this fire, to make it look more realistic. Like I said, this is kind of rudimentary. And another thing that you could do is add another particle emitter to it to make it look more like fire. For example, we have another little preset one in here that's kind of also super basic, and that's called smoke. And if you kind of combine the two, you might have this sort of smoke-like effect. There's, again, building up particle systems of many different kind of tools like this. Many different particle emitters that have different properties. Animated textures with different translucency qualities. That's the kind of artwork that you can spend hours on to add a lot to your show. I'm just going to work on the interactive effect for you today. So we've got some fire. Let's make the fire be the child of our box entity. So what we're going to do is emit from the surface of the box instead of emitting from just this, just the particle here, just the particle emitter. Here we're going to emit from the parent. And so if I grab the fire and by the words and place it by its words here and place it under box entity, we're going to get now it emits from its parent, and fire emits from its parent. Excuse me, if I click on fire and look at its properties, I'm going to pin the fire because we're going to work with it. That'll keep it here no matter what we select. It'll always stay here, so we can kind of workshop it. So under fire, we have we now, once we did it, the main thing to understand is, we did this yesterday, area, we are using parent surface. And since that is true, it emits from randomly across points on the box's surface. Now, you can see now that since it's emitting from so many different places, we don't get a lot of that overlapped effect. So we'll probably need to crank up the rate, either like we were tinkering with yesterday, the emit count, so that there's more emitted, and that actually starts to look like this thing is on fire. So I just cranked up the emit count. As long as your constant pulse, multiplied by your emit count, doesn't put you into a crazy territory. Also limited by your lifetime. If I start cranking up lifetime, you can see lifetime lets those particles live longer. At least they get out of each other's way, and you will challenge the GPU with lots of particles, but hey, go for it. Let's work with something like this. This looks pretty fiery, and all we want to do is the way that this will work. I mean, you could make this active and inactive, but that's not the best way to work with a particle emitter because, for example, take fire. I'm going to make it active false. I'm going to press play, and then if I make fire active, that would be one way you could do it. So that's one way we can make the fire begin. Would be to set it active, false, and then in the beginning, and then somewhere when we cross that trigger, we're suddenly true. So let's start, and we'll do it that way, and then we'll do it another way, where we're actually going to change the actual constant pulses frequency value, because you'll want to be able to maybe access this as well through script. And so I'm actually going to pin this constant pulse. So that's the continuous pulse that's choosing how quickly we emit 18 particles per pulse, and we're pulsing at 60 times per second. And so I'm going to leave the pulse and the particle properties pinned right here, because we're going to work them a little bit. So our technique is that we're going to be active set to false when we start, and then we're going to, through script, change active to true. So this is going to be super simple. Basically, we need to create the code in the trigger, and to do that, we can basically right-click any trigger before there's any code in it, and it'll give us edit the on-enter code. So we can do that, but I'll also show you another way. When you select the trigger, and let me get a hold of that trigger. When the trigger is in your properties, you have all of its events right here. So on the top level, see the events. We're going to say when we enter it. So we're going to go to the on-enter event, and when we click on-enter, that is the same as having right-clicked right here to edit the on-enter code. And now once there's an on-enter in our script, now it'll just say edit code. So our trigger on-enter code. What are we going to do with this trigger? I don't want it to just go and find. I don't want to like bring in the fire like this, because I'm going to clone many of these out, and I don't want to look for this particular instance of fire. I want to always look relatively to like my child fire, the fire that's down my hierarchy. So what that means is that I'm going to need to reference myself, and then I'm going to go get my children. So the code for that is self colon find node by name, and then I'm going to basically put in the name of my next level child, box entity, and then once I return, now that I've got a hold of that box entity, I can run find node by name again, and I can type in fire, exactly how the name is spelled. And I'm just going to set that active property to true. Dot active equals true. So when something crosses this box, if I've done this correctly, boom. So very cool. It's that simple. Anything, well, and sorry, it's important to note that when you draw an entity like I just did, that entity naturally has trigger activating on it. Let's just double check that if we had a node, just an empty node, we'll go to entities, node, and if you place a node in the space, the node, I'm not sure, the node does not have trigger activating on it. And so to create trigger so when I'm in play, this node, when it crosses through here, it's not activating it until I come up here and I add the attribute of trigger activating. And now we have we've now created a trigger that will set this box on fire. Additionally, we should be able to clone it. So I just held down Alt and then clicked and dragged off. When I held down Alt and Shift so I could drag it directly to its side. And now I have multiple of these. I'm going to draw not a node, but I'm going to draw a box, which will be trigger activating by default. And then I'm going to light that one up. And since I've done it correctly, it'll light each one up. So that is, each one of these trigger copies has code in it that is relative, because it just goes and finds the box entity underneath it, and it goes and finds the fire entity underneath it. I'm going to teach you, though, another way to do this, which is to, right now, the trigger goes and gets its child, and then it goes and gets the child of its child. There's another way to do this that's a little faster. Maybe you've got a much longer hierarchy. And this find node by name, we can actually basically go and search my children and then their children recursively, as long as I put this thing in here called comma true. And what that means is it is true that we want to recurse down the hierarchy. And so if we think about it, what we're saying is this trigger wants to go self, find node by name, go find fire, and recursion is true. Go look at my child and any child of it, and bring me anything. Bring me back what's called fire, and then we're gonna so that will return as it recurses down. It will find fire, and it'll then return that object to you. Now we're talking to this code now has gotten a hold of fire, so now we say dot active equals true. And so here I'm not sure if I did that on all of them, but anyway, so it wasn't this one. I'm going to delete away. It was not this one. It was that third one that I did. So I'm going to delete that one away. And this is the one with the recursion true. And I'm going to press F1 when I'm hovered over find node by name. That'll bring up the Simmetri docs. And what you'll find here is you see that there is find node by name. There's the string name, which is string, the string of the name, which is fire in our case. And then recursion, should I recurse? And that's a Boolean, so putting true or false. recurse down the hierarchy. So to put true in this case, we will go down and find them all. So this is kind of cool. And you could now kind of emit an actual node. For example, if I took an emitter and I went to node emitter, and I got this node emitter in the space, that a node emitter could, we're just missing it to the right. That node emitter could set things on fire, right? You can put that thing on your VR controller and aim it around. Another option would be to grab and throw things like a fireball to light this box on fire. And what I'm instantly looking for, what I'm instantly thinking about now that I've seen this action and I've seen the way that these boxes work, I'm thinking it would be interesting if we tested to see if the object coming through in itself was actually on fire. And so what I mean is, only will something that's on fire will set something else on fire. So let's see if we can do that. So as an example, I could make this box be not on fire, and I'll make this box be on fire. So this box has a rigid body. Both of them are trigger activating by default because they're just a basic entity, and they both have rigid bodies, which means I can throw them around, right? What I want to do is put fire on them. I can actually, I think, copy this and paste this fire. And so now I've got this same fire property here, because I like the way that this fire looked, that kind of licking flames that I had done. So I'm actually going to use these as, I'm going to use these fire, I only need one actually, excuse me. I'm going to use this fire as like the kind of templated fire to emit from a parent surface, and I'm going to put that on this box, which let me name this one. I'm going to name this one Firebox. And I'm going to name this one not Firebox, super creative. And then on the Firebox, I'm going to place the fire as a child node, and because it's got use parent surface is true, it'll light it, but you'll remember that the default setting on all these other ones is the active is set to false. So let's go ahead and set the active to true. Wow, that's a little more fire than I want. I'm going to change bring the emit count down a little bit. And I will make the lifetime a little smaller. Just kind of bring it in. And then I actually want to make the dimensions a little smaller to kind of match the size of this this object. And then the transparency maybe just a little bit more. Anyway, yeah, you can tinker with them. This will be good enough. Once your particle emitter is emitting from the parent surface, it can live anywhere in local space on that box. But I'll just go ahead and put it right in the dead center, just for kind of cleanliness and organization's sake. So this box, what's going to happen is if I take this box and place it through, it lights this up. But what I want to do is for this to not work and for this to work. And so we're going to use the same principle that we did. Let me delete these clones. We're going to use the same principle that we just did to recurse down our hierarchy, and we're going to test whether or not the thing that is coming through the trigger is indeed on fire. And so what does that mean? Well, we have pretty much most of the elements here for us. Okay, so self is the trigger itself. And self references the trigger itself. And it also, every spatial trigger passes in OBJ. OBJ is the name then of the thing coming through the trigger. In our case, it's going to be one of these boxes. So what we need to do is test if obj colon find node by name fire comma true, if there is a thing called fire on my box, or on whatever comes through here, it could be a sphere. If there is fire, then we also want to test if its active is set to true. And once we do that, I think we should have our logic in place. So let's basically we need to do a test before we can run this code. So what I'm going to do is write an if statement. If obj, and I'm going to basically be writing the rest of this. If the obj find node by name, if obj colon, I only need one colon, if the obj can, when it goes and finds a node by name recursing that has the name fire, if it returns that object, then it'll return a value of true. If I say obj this, sorry, not true. This is how you will write to test whether it exists. This is kind of an existence test. If obj find node by name fire comma true, like if this object exists, if it returns not nil, then we'll do this. We need to put an end statement around our test. So let's just test to see if this works. So first of all, good. At least we're not lighting on fire anymore from the thing that's not on fire. And let's see if this works. Wow. Awesome. Now we've got this ability to take only things that are on fire and light other things on fire. You can start to see where this can get interesting. If I can now make triggers light other triggers. Let's actually just double check to see if this in fact works. Now the problem here, I think, is that I haven't tested one whether or not it's active. Oh, nothing on this trigger is trigger activating. So that's something to keep in mind. But yeah, both of them are going to work. Let's see here. So I need to test as to whether or not it's active as well. So I can run one more line of code, another little test, and I'll basically just write it right here. If the thing exists and if fires.active equals true. So if we have an object called, if our object can find a node by name when it recurses that's named fire, we'll satisfy this condition. If the object that's returned, which is a fire object, has its active property set to true, .active equals, that's our conditional equals, set to true, then we're going to run this. Which means that if I turn off the fire in this box, I think, if I've done this correctly, he won't light that on fire until I am on fire. So if I set this active now, oops. I need to grab not the particle. I grabbed the particle underneath. I need to grab the top box. So now I can set it because I'm active. So can I set it up in such a way that, I can pull this box away. What if I scale it so that one box will enter another box and then and so on, that I can light up a series of these, kind of like a Olympic torch, kind of carry on. So if I were to have this trigger activate this trigger, something on this trigger needs to be activate this trigger over here. So what if I'm actually gonna, we'll delete this one and then we'll go and test it one time. So this trigger box, nothing here is trigger activating. Box entity, no trigger activating. Fire, no trigger activating. Let's see if a node will work. We'll put an entity, we'll just put a blank node, and I'll make that node a child of our trigger 2 copy, and I'll put that node in the dead center of our box, and I'll take the node and add trigger activating, and now this trigger should activate this trigger. Because of that trigger activating node, this node should trip this trigger over here. This trigger is then going to ask if the object that came through it has fire on it, and if that fire is active, and then it will light itself on fire if that's the case. Which means that does not satisfy. I think, though, that this... Oh, that didn't satisfy. Something didn't happen. It does look like it ran the script. Let's see what we did wrong here. So if this trigger, perhaps the recursion goes one layer down. Let's double check. I've walked out past the end of my my knowledge here. There's an interesting challenge here that I'm sure a born and bred programmer would solve for me. So we're going to leave this one as a mystery, and I'm going to connect up a fun way to ignite this initial box, and we'll do it by emitting this box. So one of the simple things you can do in VR we're going to actually use just a blank rig. What we're going to do is emit. We're going to kind of shoot this emitter. We're going to emit and shoot this box at these things out here. So we're going to put a VR rig, a blank rig in here. And then on this rig, I'm going to add the ability to fly, the press to fly. I'm going to add that to our left hand's index trigger. And then on interactions, I'm going to add, emit node. And I'm going to put that on the right hand index trigger. And then the node emitter that we look for, that's going to sit on our index trigger, will be up here. We will find it in our library. It's actually under what's called ball emitter. And I want to take a look at its, what I'm going to do is choose its source. So I want the source to be this firebox. So I went to ball emitter. So I put the emit node onto our right index trigger, and then I put on the ball emitter in our library, I went to the sample and I hit pick, and then I picked our fire, our box that starts on fire. And what that's going to mean is that when we press our right index trigger, we're going to shoot this box out. My assumption is that this box is has some mass, and I'm curious if we're going to be able to get enough physics. We want some velocity, so I'm going to actually crank up some initial velocity to like 20. And now when I go into VR mode, activate VR. Turn on my left hand. Not bad. Not bad. I'm going to do a few adjustments on this emitter here. The simultaneous, I'm going to crank up a few. Under the emit node, I'm going to edit this code to make less get emitted per unit time. And so I'm going to make this frequency not 25, but lower than that, like 5. So fewer get emitted. And I'm also going to change the fade property. I want these things to come in full opacity. So I want no in time. That's okay if they fade out. And so I think that's. And then I want more of these things, obviously. I want them to stick around for a lifetime. I may be changing the lifetime in this emit node scenario. Let's see what Amadeo wrote. I don't think we are changing anything about. We will emit 5. How many are emitting at once? The emit count is 1, 5 per second. We can have 40 out there given their time frame. Lifetime is infinite, total to emit. We're going to make these a full copy. I think that might be it. When we do a shared copy, they will see what we get when we do that. A full copy will give each one its own existence. Look at our emit node code again, see if there's anything I'm missing here. I'm not getting these things to stay out long enough. Right. I think if I release this, that's right, this emitter only hangs out while I'm pressing. That makes sense. Cool, getting there. So the trick is I have to hold down the index trigger on that to keep the emitter in place. So what I want to do is make this, bring this into the night. This is interesting because I can barely see these boxes. Let me give you guys a monoscopic view. I'm going to go to Edit, Preferences, Outputs, HMD, Screen, Add a new screen display, left. That's where the computer is. VR. I'm going to speed up my flying. I'm going to go to the VR rig. Under left hand index trigger is our fly node. I'm going to right click and hit edit code. I'm going to change that to 22. I'm also going to add to my left hand under VR. I'm going to add a laser on my right hand, and then I'm going to find my box with fire on it. I'm going to say interactions grabbable fixed, and I'm going to make that object one that I can grab. So I can actually now. I think I put the laser on my right hand by accident. Yep. I'm going to remove it from the laser. I'm going to go to interactions. I'm going to go to VR. And I'm going to add laser to my left hand. There we go. Forgot. When you build up a rig from scratch, there's a few things to forget. There's a few things to remember. I need to go press to interact on my left hand's grip trigger. Now I can grab anything that's interactions grabbable fixed. And now I am ready. I can do this. Light the torch things up. Too dark. I'm going to add a light. Change the hardness value, make it a little bigger, increase the brightness, and then I'm going to just shoot it up in the air a little bit further. There, where it's sort of night space. Getting there. Definitely intrigued by excuse me. Potentially flying through a giant matrix of this stuff. We'll start to put out a lot of particles out, but what if I did delete one of those, delete that one. What if I make a really close matrix of these? what do I just make a vertical wall? That's kind of hilarious. You could actually make it a piece of one of these boxes could ask if its neighbor to the south. It could look to its neighbor to the below could like look for if its fire is active, and then begin to slowly ramp up its continuous property or something, and then you could just set up a whole kind of fire scenario. Another thing that you could do, and this will be a little bonus thing, and this will kind of end the lesson, is on one of your oh, I just hit undo by accident. One of the things that you could do on your triggers is you can also create a burst of flame that happens right away. Like, it does sort of ramp up. You see that happening as soon as it activates. These particles, they fade in by their size. You could have you can run a function on the particle emitter called emit burst. So if we went to basically this is the emitter, and we can say we can run a function on it called emit burst, and this will emit an initial burst of particles, and we can put like a couple hundred, let's put like 300 on it, and see what happens. This will be the one in the top right corner. Let's see what we get. Yeah, I was a little too close to notice on that one. Select it. Let's edit the code on it. Let's do a few more. Let's do like 500, and then let's ignite this from. Let's ignite this like this. Yeah. Because the flame that's coming through it is so obvious, maybe you don't see it as well. But let's see what would be interesting on this. What if we went and changed its wind? What if we changed its initial velocity? Let's give that a shot. So what we're going to do is, before we emit the burst, we're going to change a property. We're going to say .physics, because we want to get to here. We want to come down to physics dot initial, lowercase I, velocity, and we'll set this to something higher than 1.25. We'll set it to like, let's set it to like 8. And then what we're going to do is set it back. And then we're going to emit this burst, and then we're going to set it back to 1.25. Let's see if we succeed with anything here. There you go. So you see that burst kind of happening. It does, one little burst. What if we take this code and we do even more particles coming out in the burst? Let's take a look. Let's emit in the number in the burst, like 800. There you go. I mean, they emit directly out of the face. There's a lot you could play with there, but you get the idea that when you could create kind of an initial explosion, and you could actually have another particle emitter in there, and maybe that particle emitter isn't emitting from the surface. You could have smoke in there. You could have all kinds of stuff. But anyway, this concept of spraying things into a box with a trigger on it. And getting this reaction sets you up for some pretty cool capabilities. Don't want to clone the VR, so I'm gonna just do a couple. Just kind of do just a cool little session. I wanted to see this as like a huge wall. Bring my VR rig back so I don't clone it. Takes it a while. Here we go. I'm gonna fly. I'm gonna do a little. Oh, I got an idea. Here we go. Zorro. That's fun. All right.